So basically, the Sophos event is to go through what they're doing to protect you and everything else, and some of the new stuff that they're doing. We did like a bit of a dummy run, and I got to admit, I was kind of blown away with some of the stuff that's going on security-wise out there. And basically, just going through the Levett stuff, everything that we're doing here with the cloud stuff and everything else, and working very closely with Sophos. With the procurement stuff and everything else. And basically, this is going to be the quick agenda. It's literally just waiting for everybody to come. I'm hoping to be a few more, but a lot of people have asked me to record this meeting, so it will be recorded and edited, and if Sophos are okay, we'll be putting this out on the website and our social pages. So there's the agenda, which we're all going to be going through. And I'd like to introduce Andrew Dreer, who is going to be taking over the screen and doing the presentation. So Andrew, if it's okay with you.
Okay, brilliant. Well, good morning, everyone. So my name's Andy Dreyer. I work in the sales engineering team here at Sophos. And in this morning's session, we're going to be talking about how you can layer your defences to protect against the latest threats. Now, Stephen just did a quick introduction to the various things that we're going to be going through today. But just to talk about my bit, what I will be talking about, we're firstly going to have a quick chat about the threat landscape. And we're going to be specifically looking at one of the studies that we do on a yearly basis called the State of Ransomware in Education. We'll also have a look at some of the stats that we have coming from our Sophos Labs infrastructure as well. We'll then move on to how Sophos can help. And furthermore, just talk about some of the other things you can do with Sophos, specifically our synchronized security, where you can integrate our solutions to provide the best protection. So I've got about 40 minutes of slides. As I say, if there's any questions as we go through, please feel free to yell those out, but there will also be time at the end of the session to go through those as well. So let's jump in and have a look at the threat landscape. Well, I guess the first thing to mention is that attacks are growing in sophistication and speed. So we do a study once a year where essentially we do an independent survey of 5,000 different organizations. Now, this is, as I say, independent, so they're not necessarily Sophos customers, but there's some very interesting stats that come from these studies. And first and foremost, it is the fact that cyber attacks are on the rise. So 61% of the organizations that we spoke to said they'd seen a marked increase in cyber attacks that had hit their organizations. And it's not hugely surprising simply because of the advent of these new services like malware as a service, ransomware as a service, where essentially anyone can get their hands on new unique pieces of malware to deploy and attack organizations. So it's something we're seeing a great increase in. Now, I'm not a fan of glamorizing ransomware, but it is big money for cyber criminals, and it does represent the vast majority of the malware that we see. And out of all of those organizations that we spoke to, 37% of those were hit by ransomware in the last year. And that number is on the rise, and those attacks are becoming far more complicated. So much so that 54% of the people that we spoke to basically said, look, these attacks that we have had are too complex for our IT team to handle. And one example of what we mean by that is what we call hands-on keyboard attacks, where attackers are commonly in your environment for quite some time before they launch their attack, doing their staging, doing their reconnaissance. And when they actually come to launch their payloads and launch their ransomware, whatever it might be, they're actually within the environment actively trying to attack the system. So there's less automation and more emphasis on an attacker trying to get around and be successful in their attack in the infrastructure. So sadly, it's no longer a case of, if we're going to get attacked, it's sadly when. Now, moving this on specifically to education, we've got some very useful stats in terms of what has affected the education sector. And last year, 44% of the educational organizations that we spoke to were hit by a ransomware attack. So yeah, it's not far off 1 in 2. So, they're not great odds for schools and colleges and educational institutions. Now, what was interesting about this was the success rate. So 58% of those that were hit, the attacker actually succeeded in encrypting the data. So these organizations were actually locked out of their data. And 35% of those actually paid the ransom. And it might sound quite surprising, but a lot of people do. we recommend against that, and I'll come on to that in more detail shortly. But paying the ransom is what a lot of organizations do, but sadly it doesn't mean that you are actually going to get all of your data back. And we've got some very useful statistics surrounding this. Now, despite all of this, 90% of educational organizations do actually have a malware incident response plan in place, but it can still be very catastrophic to an educational institution. And the costs to a business or an organization are actually the highest in education than anywhere else, the average cost being £2 million for a ransomware attack, when you factor in things like remediation, the time it took, potentially paying the ransom, all of those bits and pieces. So, naturally, it's very scary in terms of the stats that we are seeing, and like I say, it's sadly a case of if as opposed to when. Now, moving this along from education specifically, it's worth talking about what happens, if you pay the ransom. And there's some interesting data surrounding that. If we look cross-sector, so not just education customers, the percentage of data on average that gets restored if you pay the ransom is around 65% of the data. That's slightly higher in education at 68%, but still, organizations aren't getting all their data back if they're paying the ransom associated to this ransomware. And interestingly enough, out of all of the people that we spoke to, only 11% of those organizations got all of their data back. 32% got half or less. So obviously paying the ransom does not ensure you're going to get all of that data back. So moving this away from that particular study, I just wanted to touch on some of the things specifically that Sophos Labs have been seeing. Now, I introduced myself obviously earlier in the session, but I've actually worked at Sophos for the best part of 20 years. And when I joined all the way back in 2002, it was quite a different environment in terms of the threat landscape. We would literally give CDs to our customers on a monthly basis. We would post stacks and stacks of these out to all of our different customers, and they would upgrade their systems using this CD, and they would be considered safe for that month, having all of the latest detection for the new threats that we've seen. So as you would expect, with all of that, there were only a handful of threats that we were seeing on a monthly basis. But if you move forward to 2022, our Sophos Labs infrastructure now see in excess of 600,000 new samples of malware every single day. Yeah, it's absolutely staggering figures. And what's even more interesting about that number is that 3/4 of those threats will only ever be seen in a single organization, and they'll never be seen anywhere else. So it just reinforces what I was saying earlier about these ransomware as a service, these malware as a service systems, where, in essence, cyber criminals have the ability to deliver a brand new piece of malware to an organization that's never been seen before. And what makes this even more interesting is that the vast majority of threats that we see don't actually involve a malicious file being written to disk. Often it's something that's orchestrated by something like a PowerShell script. There's lots of things running in memory, but the actual malicious files themselves aren't necessarily on the disk of the machine. So, in terms of the threat landscape, huge difference over the years in terms of, firstly, how many threats we are seeing, but of course, the amount of organizations that are actually being compromised and affected by this malware as well. So, of course, how can Sophos help with this? Well, I believe everyone on this call is an existing Sophos customer in one way or another. So you will know that at Sophos, we are a IT security vendor that provides cybersecurity solutions spanning numerous areas of IT security. And our focus is to make sure that that is simple to manage. So you will most likely currently be using our Sophos Central Management Console to manage your Sophos solutions. And that can be used to manage any Sophos solution that you license from us, whether it's our endpoint protection, whether it's our server protection, whether it's cloud management, whether it's firewalls. And that's exactly what you can see in the screen here. All of our software solutions, our hardware, also all of our managed services can be managed in Sophos Central. But of course, all of our solutions are underpinned by our threat intelligence from Sophos Labs. So all of the things that they're working hard to do, identifying new malware, new criminal gangs, new methods, that is of course all being shared amongst our technology stack. And we also heavily utilize what we call our data lake. And this is telemetry that is coming from all of our customers' devices, talking about how things are taking place within the environment, techniques we're seeing, new threats we're seeing. And that means that we can actively learn and make sure that something that we've seen in another environment is reflected and protected against in your environment. So we're constantly learning adaptive cybersecurity ecosystem to keep you safe. Now, just to go one step further with this, another key focus of Sophos is to ensure that we integrate our solutions together to provide the best protection. Now, just to give a quick insight to how this looks, and we call this synchronized security, is if, for example, you were an endpoint customer from Sophos and you also further down the line decided to implement our firewalls, for example, those are solutions that can be managed directly through Sophos Central. But they actually integrate with each other to provide the best protection. And what that means is that any endpoint that is protected by Sophos would be in constant communication with your firewall. Those endpoints would be providing a health status saying, well, this is the state I'm in. So if I'm up to date, if I've got no problems, I'm in a green state, and I'm going to let the firewall know that. And the firewall can respond and say, brilliant, well, based on the fact you're green, you can do all the things you need. You can hop across the VPN to another site. You can get out to the internet. You can access other resources within the network. But if that endpoint got hit by malware, for example, the status of that endpoint is immediately lowered to red. The firewall is notified, and it means that it can immediately respond and block that device getting out to the internet where it can do harm, block it hopping across the VPN to another school or another site or another campus, for example, but also make sure that the firewall lets every device on the network that is running Sophos know that there's a device with a problem, and to instruct them to reject connections from that device. So by utilizing our solution stack together, it just means that we can always provide the best protection and limit what that threat or what that incident can do and the ramifications that it has on the environment. So that is what we call synchronized security. But at this point, I'm going to jump directly onto the endpoint, because we talked about how we're seeing so many new threats on a daily basis. And we've talked about how there's new techniques that cyber criminals are using to infect your environment. Now, I believe that everyone on this call is already utilizing our Intercept X solution. And Intercept X is our next generation endpoint and server protection solution. And the idea behind that is it is protecting you against both known and unknown threats. And that is really important because, like I mentioned earlier, we see 600,000 new samples of malware every single day. So chances are, if malware does get into your organization, it may be something that we haven't seen before. And Intercept X is there to provide features that protect you against things, firstly, that we know about, but also those things that we haven't seen before. Now, I'm not going to touch on this too heavily because I appreciate that you're already Intercept X customers, but it is worth just explaining what the foundations of your protection are doing within your estate. So I mentioned earlier that we see 600,000 new samples of malware every single day, which of course is a staggering figure. But that figure is only growing. You know, that could be 700,000 next year. It could be even further than that. But regardless of what that figure is, Intercept X has a number of technologies that's designed to identify the techniques that malware uses. So we don't need to have seen that malware before in order to incriminate it. So it starts on the left-hand side here with what we call anti-exploit. You know, whilst we see these 600,000 new samples of malware every single day, that malware can only use a certain amount of exploit techniques to infect you. So our anti-exploit technology looks for those techniques. If it sees such a technique, it immediately stops it, identifies the file that was causing that, and of course, keeps you safe. But you'll then see additional capabilities, things like machine learning at the top of the screen. And this is essentially an algorithm or a model that we are constantly evolving. We train this by throwing millions of clean, millions of malicious samples at that machine learning model. And essentially it learns what is good, what is bad, what is indifferent, and essentially can make a judgment call on any new file that we throw at that model. And that just means that even if we haven't seen those threats before, we can identify them and remediate them, based on that machine learning model. And we talked about how ransomware is on the rise. So on the right-hand side, you'll see specifically the component anti-ransomware. That's looking specifically for those ransomware techniques, those file operations, those things that ransomware actually does when it runs. And if we see such behavior, we can immediately jump in and say, we think this is ransomware. So as a precaution, any files that potential ransomware calls from disk, let's take a cache of those so that when we can incriminate this, we can remove it and of course restore those files back in clear text. And this is happening literally in fractions of a second, where we can detect that ransomware, say it's definitely ransomware and remove it, but also cache any files it called from disk so we can restore them back to the system. So as you'll see, there's lots of things that you're already doing to protect you against these new threats that we're seeing. And of course, anything that we detect will provide root cause analysis to tell you exactly how did it get in? Was this someone clicking a link in Outlook? Did someone double click a file that they downloaded from the internet, for example? And it gives you the ability to understand exactly what is happening there and plug those holes. But like I say, that is where you are at the moment. That is Intercept X that is currently deployed to your systems. But we talked about threats becoming very advanced and the increase in things such as hands-on keyboard attacks. And this is where our second module comes in, or our second protection tier called XDR, which is Extended Detection and Response. Now, just to give you an insight to what this is all about, I mentioned earlier about how attacks are becoming more advanced, where commonly attackers are in your environment for quite some time, staging their attack. And the reason that they do that is that they can essentially probe your defenses, perform reconnaissance to understand where your vulnerable systems are, where your data exists. And for them to make that decision, should they steal your data? Should they hold you to ransom? And of course, they're doing this to ensure that when they actually deploy their malicious payloads, they know that they're going to be successful. Now, Intercept X, like I mentioned earlier, is great at automatically detecting and removing threats. But in those early stages of an attack, an attacker might not be using malicious code. Chances are they're using existing system tools and using living off the lander techniques to infect your systems and enhance their attack. So in order to detect against that, we have XDR, or Extended Detection and Response. And that is designed to give you very early visibility of potential indications of compromise within your environment. And if we find those, XDR provides you with a great threat hunting toolkit to very quickly identify what the problem is, give you the ability to apply some human context, but most importantly, remediate that attack before that attacker can advance and deploy ransomware and their payloads to your organization. And I think this diagram explains it very well. Like I was saying earlier, Intercept X is great at detecting the bad and leaving the good. But in any environment, with any vendor, there is always what we call the gap, that area between good and bad. And that's why what we call EDR solutions were originally released, or an endpoint detection and response. And these were there to give IT teams essentially lots of information about the things that couldn't be incriminated. But the problem was that gap was too big, that grey area was too big, and IT teams were being overwhelmed with information, and they kind of lost sight of what they needed to do. So the benefit of using our XDR capability over and above Intercept X is that we are already great at that core protection and getting rid of all the noise, all of the things we can do automatically. And that means that our XDR solution provides you with great visibility of the things that are potentially a problem and give you a great threat hunting toolkit to investigate and respond to that. So what does that look like? What do we mean about indications of compromise and early indications of an attack? Well, the way that this would start is that using our XDR toolkit, we would identify to you something that we've seen happen within your environment that we don't quite like the look of. And we can see something here that has been detected. Basically, a Windows Management Instrumentation, or WMI command, has been identified as running on one of the devices within the estate. Now, WMI is something that can be used by IT teams for legitimate reasons, but it's also used by cyber criminals in living off the land techniques and utilizing what's already on devices to advance their attack. So what we can do is allow you to answer that question and say, is this a problem or is it not? So if we have a look at what's happening here, we can see a particular IP, a particular device and a location. And furthermore, we can see, well, this is the file wmic.exe that was run, and we can actually see the command that was run on the right-hand side here. And when we can look at this command, just taking a quick look at that, we can see that somebody is trying to access a certain IP address with administrative credentials, and they are trying to create a PowerShell process on another machine. Now, you might look at this immediately and say, well, the user here is John Mayer. We know who John Mayer is. He's in the IT team. This is part of his job. This is what he would be doing. He's trying to run a command on a remote machine, for example. But at the same time, you might look at that and say, well, actually, no. John Mayer is somebody who maybe works on the reception desk at the school. Why would that particular user be trying to run commands to run a PowerShell instance on a remote device? And of course, that is your human context that you can put to this to say, well, this doesn't look right. It looks like Hawk Win10.002. This machine is in fact compromised. So instantly we've got that call to action. Sophos has identified something that they think doesn't look quite right. You very quickly looked and given your human context to say, no, this doesn't look right at all. And you can now advance your threat hunt. And when we talk about threat hunting, it's a great system that allows you to, in essence, query your devices and understand if there's any telltale signs of threats. And this can be used for a number of reasons. It's very powerful. So, for example, it might be that you've come into the office and you've seen a headline on an IT security news site that says there's a new Windows 10 vulnerability that needs to be patched. And you might have a question to say, okay, well, I wonder what devices have this patch or don't have this patch. And that's an example of a query that you can run on an endpoint, asking that device, what patches do you actually have deployed? And that endpoint, wherever it is, whether it's in the school, whether it is in somebody's home, as long as it's got an internet connection and is online, that device is going to come back and say, well, these are the patches that I have installed, or more importantly, these are the patches I don't have installed. But like I say, this is a threat hunting toolkit that allows you to ask further questions. So if we use the example of that Win10 machine we were just looking at on the last slide, you might want to know, well, does this machine or any other machines have remote desktop connections connected to it at the moment? Is there potentially an attacker trying to remotely connect to this device and cause harm? Furthermore, are there any strange network processes on this machine that suggest an attacker is calling out to a third-party location to exfiltrate data or to advance their attack? Or has there been any evidence of any failed login attempts on any servers, endpoints, anything along those lines, which suggests an attacker is trying to probe your defenses? And one that I feel really kind of brings this into perspective is this one here, which is asking every device on the network, have there been any PowerShell events run in the last 30 days that are using encoded or encrypted data? And again, that's an example of a technique or something an attacker might use to advance their attack, running a PowerShell script that's encrypted so anti-malware systems can't actually see the contents of that script. So, of course, XDR is a great toolkit where you can simply ask that question, where you can say, well, has there been any such suspicious scripts being run within my environment? And that, of course, will instantly identify where potentially a malicious actor is compromising some of your devices. Now, it's all well and good me talking about how you can go through this process of threat hunting and determine if there is indeed a problem. But what would this look like to you? How would this give you information and useful information to act upon? Well, if you run one of these queries, as I said earlier, whether that device is at home, whether it is on the school network, even if that device is now turned off, you have the ability to investigate that machine. And this is the kind of data that you would expect to see back. So in this particular script that I have run, we can see this is telling me which processes on this machine have an open network connection. And we can see the various processes there, the ports that they have open, the IP addresses that they're connecting to. So if you were investigating this machine and you thought it was compromised, you might run some further checks. You might say, okay, well, we've got a process here that's using a strange port. It's calling out to a strange IP address. I might want to understand what that IP address is. Who owns that IP? Is it on a blacklist? Is it a known IP block? But I might also want to look at things like the file access history. This strange process that's got a network connection, has it been accessing any of my sensitive files or student data, for example? And furthermore, you can generate a visual threat case to see exactly what this file is doing in your environment right now. Is this in line with how the school works? For example, if you see a process that is sending data to an Amazon S3 bucket or Dropbox, for example, you might ask the question, well, does the school use Dropbox? Does the school use Amazon S3? Is this in line with how the school works? And of course, that puts you in the position where you can say, no, this doesn't map to how we work. I think this is an attack. We need to remediate. And through that XDR toolkit, you are able to get a command prompt directly to that device through Sophos Central. That's where you can run task kill commands, remove folders, remove registry keys, anything you might need to do to remediate that threat remotely on that device and get that attacker out of the network before they can cause harm. So that's just a quick introduction to what that XDR, Extended Detection and Response Toolkit, could provide to your IT team to essentially identify these indications of compromise early and give you the ability to respond to that so an attacker can't advance their attack. Now, of course, XDR is extremely useful, but one of the things that you may have thought when looking through that is, do we have the time? Do we have the resources as a school or college IT team, for example, to put to this all-important threat hunting task? Because let's face it, attackers know when people are likely to be in the office. That's why it's very common for attacks to start at 2 o'clock in the morning, to start at weekends, where they know things are going to be successful. So if you're looking at this and thinking, well, that's great technology, we'd really like to be able to utilize this, and we see, of course, the value in that, but don't necessarily have the resources within the IT team, or maybe the threat hunting skill sets to put to that, that's where the third and final tier comes in here on the right hand side, and that is called NTR, which is Managed Threat Response. This is a 24/7 human-led service from Sophos, which is essentially manned by our forensic threat hunting experts, and they are there to essentially monitor your environment 24/7. So it doesn't matter what time of day it is, whether it's a public holiday, they are monitoring your environment for indications of compromise. And essentially what they'll be doing is proactively hunting and validating threats within your environment, working out if an incident that happened on machine A is related to something that happened on machine B, correlating all of this information together and using their forensic threat hunting skill to say, this is definitely the start of an attack within the environment. Now, they will be using vast amounts of data to inform their threat hunts. So they will be pulling lots of information from your systems, analyzing that, and the moment that they see something they don't like, they will launch that investigation, use that forensic threat hunting skill, and determine, is this a problem or is it not? And as part of that, they will, of course, be applying business and human context. Why would an attacker be taking this route? Why would they be interested in this machine? Why would they be interested in that data? And the moment that they have concluded that investigation, where they've said, yep, this is definitely the early stages of a threat, they will initiate actions to disrupt and neutralize that threat on your behalf. And that means that the attacker is removed from the network, their persistence is removed, and they're no longer in a position where they can advance their attack. And most importantly, once they have remediated that, they will provide actionable evidence to essentially tell you, well, how did you get to this point in the first place? How did this attacker get into the environment? So, of course, the outcome of this whole process is to ensure that any attack can't advance to the stage where those attackers are deploying ransomware and deploying those malicious payloads to your organizations. So how would you work with the MTR team? So if you did decide to come on board with this service, there's 3 response modes that the MTR team can use to work with you. Now, these aren't influenced by price. You can go for any of these as part of your engagement with us. But on the left-hand side, you'll see the first one is called Notify. And that basically means that we are acting, or the MTR team are acting as an extension of your security operations center. We're doing all of the investigation. We are doing all of the checks to determine, is this actually malicious, and working out everything that's involved with that attack. But in essence, we'll be providing detail to you for you to remediate and prioritize that response. However, if you don't have a IT team that is maybe that large, or maybe the skill set to support that, that's where we have collaborate and authorize modes that you'll see in the middle and on the right there. And that is where we are taking far more control of the remediation of this particular threat. So collaborate allows us to work with you where we have a dedicated point of contact. And essentially, we will be working with you to identify and remediate any threats that we find. But if you simply want to pass it over to us to say, we want you to do all of the investigation, we want you to do all of the investigation and remediation, that is where you have the authorize mode on the right-hand side here. And this just means that if it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we find something we don't like, we know that it's definitely malicious and we don't want that to advance, it means that we will remove that without having to contact you, and make sure that when you come into the office in the morning, you've got a report saying this is what we did and that attack has been stopped. So that is the advantage of using the authorize mode. Now, I appreciate that I have been talking a lot about the latest state of threats, how cyber criminals are attacking organizations, and introducing these new services like XDR and MTR to mitigate this. But what I would like to quickly go through now is just explain an attack example. Now, we've got countless attack examples that the MTR team have identified and, of course, remediated before they become a problem. But I think it's important to go through one of these just to show how advanced these attacks can be and why MTR, or certainly XDR as well, is very important. Now, this particular customer, obviously, are completely anonymized, so we're not going to say who they are, but they are an MTR customer that were working with us in a notify mode. And just to show how this all started, it started with PowerShell running the password stealing tool Mimikatz. Now, I don't know how many people on this call might be familiar with Mimikatz, but it can be used for penetration tests, but it can also be used for, by cyber criminals to advance attacks. So in this scenario, we detected that PowerShell had invoked Mimikatz on a device within this customer's network. So naturally, an investigation was immediately started by that MTR team. Now, the first thing, of course, they asked was, is this expected? Are you running a pen test in your environment at the moment? If not, you need to isolate this device that we've identified and knock that off the network. And that is something you can do automatically through Sophos Central. Now, as you would expect, the customer came back very quickly and said, no, we are not doing a pen test. This is totally unexpected. And they isolated that device. However, the investigation didn't stop there. And as a result of this, the investigation uncovered a number of other things that was happening at the same time on a number of different devices. For example, there was a virtual machine that was running on one of the service desk team's devices that had a new privileged account that was created on it. And this happened at roughly the same time. So again, our MTR team made the customer aware, are you aware of this privileged account that's just been created whilst this was happening? Was that you? And again, it turned out that it wasn't the customer, and this was actually an attacker that had managed to create a new account with privileges within the environment. Now, as this was going on, further reconnaissance activity was identified on yet another device. So things like DNS enumeration, the running of WMI scripts, all of those kind of things were identified on a handful of devices. And what was taking place was that this attacker was trying to identify admin accounts and dump them to a zip file that was going to be exfiltrated. So essentially that the attacker could get back into the environment and cause harm. Now, because this customer was in a notify mode, all of the adversary files, the process information, the unprotected devices, all of those kind of things that allowed the attacker to advance to this point were identified and shared with the customer. And from all of the forensics performed by the MTR team, it was confirmed that that file that was being staged for exfiltration was not exfiltrated out of the organization. So the attacker was never able to get that out of the environment. Now, as part of this, the assets that were compromised, the way that the actual attacker got into the environment, was identified and passed to the customer. And of course, ongoing remedial guidance was provided. So the reason that I show this is to essentially show the complexities of an attack, how sometimes attackers are using tools that are perfectly legitimate and by themselves don't look like an attack. But furthermore, showing how this was a multi-stage attack with lots and lots of different devices. And the MTR team are there to very quickly pull all of that information together, determine is this or is this not an attack, but most importantly, remediate that before it becomes a problem. So that just shows that third and final protection tier that's going to allow you to essentially get ahead of these bad guys, allow our MTR team to identify these attacks early and prevent those advanced attacks from progressing within your environment. Now, just to pull this all together, we focused heavily here on the endpoint side of things, the XDR, the MTR, and how that can really help in the early identification of compromise. But if you are leveraging additional components of the Sophos product suite, you can layer your defenses to provide even more protection and make sure that these are working together to provide the best protection. And just to show very quickly how this would work, if you were to use a Sophos firewall within your environment over and above those solutions that we were talking about, such as XDR and MTR, there is a number of capabilities that you can use to enhance protection even further. So let's just say there is an attacker trying to get an exploit into the environment. We'll use the Eternal Blue exploit as an example here. That would be blocked by our intrusion prevention system that functions on the Sophos firewall, preventing that exploit from even getting into the environment in the first place. At the same time, if there was an endpoint that happened to be compromised, maybe it had an undetected botnet or something along those lines that was trying to call out to the outside world, that is something that will be picked up by our advanced threat protection on the firewall, notifying the administrator that there's a device on the network trying to call out to a botnet or a call home site. Now, furthermore, if anyone is trying to download anything malicious, either accidentally or intentionally, our TLS inspection on the Sophos firewall as part of our web protection would block that coming in. And if that is a file that is unknown to Sophos, our zero-day protection in the cloud will ensure that we can sandbox that threat, see what it's doing, to make a judgment as to whether that should be allowed into the environment or not. However, that's showing what we can do at the perimeter. But I talked about earlier in the session how you can utilize our synchronized security to provide the best protection and how that allows those endpoints to integrate with the firewall. So last but not least, if you are using our synchronized security as part of this system, all of those endpoints protected by Sophos on your network will be sharing a health status with the firewall. And as you can see here, these devices are currently green, and that means those endpoints are able to do everything they should usually be able to do within the environment. But if, for example, someone within the environment got a malicious email, maybe they double-clicked a malicious payload, or they clicked a link that downloaded some malware, the endpoint would immediately detect that malware and lower the endpoint's health status to red. And because synchronized security is being used here, it means that that endpoint will be sharing that red health status with the firewall. So the firewall will instantly know that that device has got a red state and will block that device from getting out to the internet, hopping across the VPN, or accessing other resources in the network. And as a result of that, if that device or the threat on that device tried to spread laterally across the network, the endpoint is going to block that, simply because the Sophos firewall will do a duty of care broadcast to every device on the network running Sophos to say we have a machine, it's infected, do not accept connections from this device until you hear from me again. So by bringing all of those layers of defense together, the synchronized security on the endpoint and all of these security features, it means that every device within Sophos Central knows exactly what is going on, and we can share intelligence to provide the best protection and minimize the impact of any security incidents taking place within the environment. So we've gone through lots of bits and pieces. What, the problem that we've seen, how ransomware is on the rise, how attacks are becoming far more complicated, and the IT teams are struggling to be able to keep up with the complex nature of those attacks. So what do we recommend? Well, first and foremost, sad as it may be, assume you will be hit. It's not a case of if, it is a case of when. Have an instant response plan in place. And that means doing things like making backups. Make sure you have offsite backups, and that, should, for whatever reason, your data become encrypted, make sure you are in a position where you can effectively restore that data. Now, we've talked in this session about how you can deploy layered protection. So starting with your Intercept X that you already have, but utilizing those XDR or MTR capabilities and the Sophos firewall that we mentioned earlier. But don't pay the ransom, because as we saw, that is no guarantee that that is going to get all of your data back. As we saw, only 11% of the people that we surveyed got their data, got all of their data back as a result of paying.
That's incredible, really.
Absolutely, and it's sad that that's the case, but I guess the thing to remember here is that these are cyber criminals. From a trust perspective, it's just something that you can never guarantee in that respect.
Yeah.
And we talked about the benefits of the MTR service. One of the biggest things that's required in order to protect you against the latest threats is human context. All vendors will do what they can from an automated perspective, but there is the need for that human context to protect you against the latest threats by identifying, does this sit in line with how we work as an educational institution? And finally, have a malware recovery plan in place. Who is going to be doing this? Whose role is it to remediate these threats? And like I said earlier, as part of that MTR service, we are there to assist with any such incidents that might take place within your environment. So that brings me to the end of today's session. I hope that has been useful. Hopefully, as you'll have seen there, that Sophos provide, layers of protection spanning a number of different areas of cybersecurity. We make that as easy as possible to manage, and furthermore, we ensure that we integrate all of our solutions together to provide the best protection by sharing intelligence. So at this point, I will finish the session and pass over to Stephen to manage Q&A.
Yeah, I know we were just briefly talking about this before this started, Andrew. I think with the IT, security and everything else, we just assume it's there, it's working. We just think it's there, we know it's there, we pay for that service and it's working. But what we don't, like you said there, if you thought for 1 second, there was a 1 in 2 chance of you being burgled or whatever it is, you put security cameras in your house and make all, when it's that, it just, like you say, 11% was it that people pay the ransomware and.
So 11% of 11% of the people that we studied that paid the ransom got their full data back. The vast majority of
that's
people
just
yeah. So it is very scary, and you're completely right. I mean, it's changed. Many years ago there was the term set and forget. Now, we at Sophos do everything we can to make sure that there is a great policy in place as default across your endpoints and across your servers. But as I was alluding to earlier, you can't rely solely on automation to protect you against the latest threats. At Sophos, our detection rates are extremely high, as are our accuracy rates. But, as I say, the sheer amount of threats that we see on a daily basis, and furthermore, the complexity of the attacker being within your environment, doing a hands-on keyboard attack means that, automation alone can't solve this. That is why there is the need for human context. There is the need for IT teams to be proactive, monitoring the environment for indications of compromise. And if they aren't in a position to do that, to be able to utilize a managed service such as our managed threat response to provide that investigation remediation on your behalf.
Yeah. So, Simon, have you got any questions on this at all?
Yeah, I feel like I've got millions, actually, not millions.
Well, you feel free, please, because I appreciate
think
that we ran this session more in a non-interactive state because we didn't know how many people were going to be on. So please do go ahead.
I'm not particularly. This isn't an area that I fear that. Things have got a lot worse exponentially, haven't they, really? And I think, it's kind of, we're a primary school. There's 3 of us, so 3 primary schools, not formally a trust yet, but we'll assume we'll see us as a trust. But we're running Sophos. We've obviously gone over to Intercept X, and so we're a little bit better covered. But listening to what you're saying today, I don't feel like I'm particularly doing enough. So the first question really is educational costs. Now, obviously, we've got Intercept X. It doesn't feel overly expensive. It's quite pleasant. There's no pain there. I know that if we go over to XDR, because I've had quotes on it before, that it jumps. An obvious reason why, because it does a hell of a lot more. So I'm kind of thinking, that's a big deal. I get it because I'm IT. I'm suitably anxious, with the greatest respect from your presentation, to push that forward. But the time it gets to SLT and governors, that message is difficult to sustain momentum, I think. So, it's not so much a question as much of a statement. I think the problem we have is with all the primary schools we support is convincing them to splash out on that XDR, or even further the monitored end. I don't really know what to do about that, whether to invest in better backup, so have an offline backup, just assume that if we get hit, we get hit and we'll start again and restore, because our systems are fairly simple. Or whether to prevent rather than recover.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, incident response in that respect just covers so many areas, like you're saying there, the effective backups, testing those backups and all of those kind of things. I guess one thing to consider is, yes, like you mentioned, there's the XDR and there's the MTR side of things. The XDR is tremendously useful, but the thing that we always say is that unless someone is actually monitoring that, and it's part of their role within the school to be looking at that and doing that threat hunting, if there isn't someone to do that, XDR itself isn't going to provide you with any added protection, because it does require a human to be involved with that process. It's at that point that it goes over to MTR, which is managed threat response, which is, of course, our forensic threat hunting experts doing that investigation and remediation for you. Now, you're completely right. Naturally, especially in education, appreciate budgets can often be quite restricted. I can't speak on what commercials look like for that, because I'm more on the technical side as opposed to the commercial side. But what I would say is that we do have very good documentation here at Sophos with regards to our proposals for MTR. Essentially, what do the alternative costs look like? The fact that the attacks are becoming more advanced. Obviously, we can talk about that. But in terms of how do you protect yourself against that, naturally, when you look at something like a service from MTR and the costs that are involved with that, you kind of have to consider, well, what is the alternative? Employing a team that's going to work 24/7 round the clock, if you see what I mean, is one thing that's obviously very costly. The impact financially, reputation, and all the other things from a ransomware perspective, obviously is the other alternative, where there's potentially ransoms to pay, all of those kind of things. So Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is we can assist with that if that is conversations that you do need to have with the senior leadership teams. We're very used to being involved in that if you'd like us to provide more information on that. But we also have, as I say, great proposal documents that we can provide that lay it out in very simple terms to say, why is this a problem? Why is it needed? And to show you the cost effectiveness of that solution. So I'd say, Simon, obviously stick in touch with Levett, stick in touch with us. If you did need any assistance with that, we'd be happy to help.
Well, I think some documentation would be good if we could get some more. I mean, I think we support quite a few primary schools in the area for their IT. So even regardless of what we're doing as a trust, we've got 13 clients that are other primary schools, and they'll all be asking the same question as well. So even if we decide not to, or to go halfway or full way, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other school is going to be the same. What about sort of segues quite nicely over to most primary schools now are considering going over to the cloud for their data, not necessarily for their server services, but going on to 365 and SharePoint and Teams and all the rest of it. So if we move our data over to 365 and related products like SharePoint and all the rest of it, does that make us less of a does that change our attack surface? Does that change the threat possibility?
So it doesn't so much change the threat possibility. I mean, digital transformation is certainly into the public cloud, and systems like Office 365, of course, is very common because there's great benefits to doing so. Intercept X, of course, would still be protecting your endpoints, as with things such as XDR and MTR. Through Sophos Central, we actually have integrations with Office 365 as well, so we can absorb certain data to work out if there's any, strange behavior there. You could kind of have to see it as analytics coming from all of your systems, whether it be endpoints, whether it be servers, whether it be integrations from Office 365. All of that information is going up to the MTR team and being heavily analysed to determine is there something not quite right here. And of course, if there is, that's where the MTR team get involved. So certainly having Office 365 and putting data there wouldn't be a limitation from our perspective. It can help the attack surface, but it can also cause problems, because if you have compromised Office 365 accounts, those kind of things, it means that data is also readily accessible. So it's the same problem but in a different fashion, but if you see what I mean.
No, I think I do. I mean, I've recently been on I did another Sophos training or session like this, which was really interesting for me because, as I say, my skill set isn't this really. And I think what was interesting and alarming really was the fact that ransomware isn't just about running scripts. It's not just about viruses. It's about humans getting in and fiddling. and ultimately, if that means that somebody compromises a 365 account, gets onto your Azure, creates an admin, they've got access to the data and they've compromised you without the use necessarily of running PowerShells or scripts and all the rest of it, then that's still a threat. That's still opening up possibilities to then be to run PowerShells within 365. I might say that, and then thus getting the same results. Yeah.
So I mean, there's lots of things you can. This comes again down to the layers of defense, putting things like two-factor authentication in place for stuff like Office 365. So there's lots of things that you can do to reduce that attack surface, certainly. But running PowerShell scripts, it really depends on what level you're going in, because Office 365 essentially is software as a service, obviously email, workspaces, all of those kind of things. If you do have actual systems in Microsoft Azure, maybe servers where data exists, all of those kind of things, those are things that you would be able to protect with MTR, with XDR as well. And like I say, we have that Office 365 integration too.
But the threat from a client perspective is from ransomware, is it the same in 365 as it is on local data on your server? Can they encrypt and lock down your data on 365 in the same way that they can on a Windows server stuck in a cupboard in the school.
Yeah, so that they don't really have as much the Office 365 side of things. The biggest risk there is if somebody gets in. Firstly, yes, they could steal data. I don't think they would have the ability to get to the point where they would necessarily encrypt it, but they could certainly steal it, and then it's a breach that needs to be needs to be reported. But
because that's an important distinction, isn't it? Because this is what we need to unpick. So if we're bearing in mind that school data really only a very small amount of that data is worth is a concern from ransomware. So it'd be your special category data, wouldn't it? It'd be like your child protection stuff and your finance stuff. The rest of it's all planning and stuff kids produce. So I know from like data protection and GDPR, only a tiny amount of it actually matters if we get attacked or if we have a breach or something like that. So it's about, from our perspective, it's about pragmatically trying to weigh up, do we put all these big measures in place? And there's no doubt that these measures are brilliant, but to what degree do we need to do that? And if we're migrating over to the cloud, how does that change the way that we react to that as schools? I'm talking about,
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best way to put it is Office 365 is just another attack surface, shall we say. So if you think traditionally attack surfaces might be endpoint servers, firewalls, or whatever that might be, Office 365 is another one. So let's just say somebody gets access due to a compromised Office 365 account. Yes, they could steal data, but furthermore, they might imitate a particular user to send maybe emails to another user within the environment saying, look, hey, it's Bob from finance, could you transfer this money? Or furthermore, as is very common as well, could you provide me with access to your machine, or could you double click this file, which is the latest invoice or something along those lines? What in turn that has done is given an attacker access to the system, where they're now in a position where they might have something like a reverse shell into the environment where they can start advancing their attack. So I think all of these things need to be seen as an attack surface. It isn't necessarily the type of data that is there and whether it can be encrypted. It's what that Office 365 compromise would allow them to do to further their attack, essentially.
And it's changing the type of threat, isn't it, as well? So I'm from what I'm hearing, I don't know if I'm right in saying this, but
no, please go ahead
and do put me right. You're almost, it feels a little bit like you're more prone to ransomware, or that is more of a serious concern if you've got all your data on a server physically in your premises than it is if, say, for example, we were to put our data on the cloud. However, we then have other threats that we need to be concerned about, like compromised accounts, data breaches, stealing of data, simply going on there and downloading data.
Absolutely.
Et cetera. So it shifts the goalpost slightly, doesn't it? But there's still threats and there's still a concern.
Completely, and you're completely right. It's all about reducing that attack surface, and with MTR, MTR is a service that's not just focused on ransomware. It's focused on the threat. Everything from breaches to lateral movement, all of those kind of things. Now, usually what we find is the end game of an attacker is something that allows them to monetize what they've done. So whether that be they're stealing your data and want to sell it on the dark web because there's personal information or maybe financial information in there, or whether it's they want to be able to hold you to ransom. Sometimes both, sadly, but that usually is the end game. And things like, for example, education and also healthcare are very heavily targeted, because at the end of the day, attackers know that downtime isn't really tolerated in those environments. So that is definitely their outcome, what they want to achieve. But the way that they might go about it to achieve their goals could be, like you say, through Office 365 compromised accounts, through double clicking attachments or traditional access to an organization on a device or a server.
Okay, all right. the malware plan, the disaster recovery plan. Do you have a template for that, or is that something?
I'd have to take that offline. Actually, it's a very good question. I know that we always have advice on what should be involved. Whether we have any templates, I couldn't tell you. But let me take that question offline. I'll double check and we can get some information.
Schools like templates. We don't like to we're all spinning so many bloody plates. If we can get a policy we don't have to write and just stick our logo on it, then that's a win.
Absolutely.
There might be a branch of business that Sophos could go into supporting policy writing.
I'm sure there's something to that degree, but I'll have to double check.
Brilliant. And lastly, because I appreciate there's nobody else on here, is there? Oh, Chris, I didn't see Chris. He's anonymous.
Chris is Sophos, so
I'm an employee of Sophos, so don't worry about me.
Okay, so it's me then, so I'll steal all the time. So the last question is firewall. So we have our firewall is provided by our ISP, which is ETM, which is a big consortium for schools in the area. You've probably heard of them, I would imagine. So we have a firewall physically in the school. They manage it. It does this thing. We've got a DNS sinkhole, whatever the bloody hell that is. So I believe it's a good thing. So yay for that. Should we be considering an additional firewall, or would that? What's your feelings and opinions on that? Firewall.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, having a firewall is certainly the most important thing. Whether you decide to move over to Sophos, I would say, firstly, things to consider is, how effective is the protection that the firewall is providing you? Is there anything it isn't providing you with, like reports that you might need for schools, all of those kind of things? What I can tell you, of course, is the benefit of moving over to the Sophos firewall is that firstly, it can be managed in Sophos Central. So when you log on to Sophos Central, not only do you get a full insight to your server estate, your endpoint estate, and the protection for those, but furthermore your firewall. Are there any incidents on the firewall? Are there things that you need to be aware of? The other benefit over and above management is the fact that these do integrate with each other. So at the moment, if you're using a different vendor, I'm sure that it's got technologies that will detect X, Y, and Z and hopefully keep you safe from those, but it won't be getting information from your Sophos endpoints, saying, look, machine A, we kind of, I hate using a COVID analogy in the days we are at the moment, but it is very similar along the lines of like the firewall saying, right, well, this device over here or this person over here has COVID, so I'm going to do a public service announcement to everyone else within the school to say that person has COVID, do not go anywhere near them until you hear from me and I know that they're back to health. And that's exactly how the Sophos firewall works. The endpoint detects the malware, says, well, I'm going to deal with this, but whilst I do that, I'll lower my health status to red, I'll let the Sophos firewall know, and the firewall can say, well, brilliant, let me limit what you can do whilst you're in this state, and I'll let every other device on the network know you're having a few problems, and as soon as you're back up to green, I'll let them know that everything's fine. So it's a nice self-healing system, but the advantage is the blast radius is heavily reduced. If malware tried to jump from one machine to another, or an attacker tried to jump from one machine to another, because of that, because the firewall's in there, that endpoint will be notified to say don't accept that. So there's great benefits to doing it. I don't want to say get rid of the firewall that you have, just those are the benefits to moving over. It is going to add to that, and it would help those services like MTR and XDR because they form part of that telemetry and all of that info that our teams will be using to keep you safe, basically.
And is it a done thing where do people have two firewalls? So could we have a firewall with E2VN that deals with all the filtering and all the the safeguarding element that they do so very well, and we just say, but don't just allow this to do its thing and in and out, and that sits locally, and is that a thing?
Absolutely. So we deal very, very heavily with education. Well, we do deal with all kinds of sectors, but some organisations that we go into already have a firewall. It does something they like, and they're happy with it, but maybe it doesn't provide a feature that they know we do. So we can very happily sit in line act as a tier 2 firewall, or just provide a certain feature like web filtering and not the firewalling, or vice versa. So it really comes down to what area that you're looking to fulfill with that. And I think what you're alluding to there actually is that if you did have us as an additional box, we could take care of that synchronized security piece, sit in front of what you already have, and we're very used to doing that as well. So they're always the firewall essentially is a modular based system. So we've got some customers that use every module on it, firewall, web, all of those bits, but others just use the module that's relevant to their requirements because they've got a system in place that's already doing the other bits. So we can cater for either of those essentially.
Just to sort of close things off, guys, Paul's asked me just to let you know that we do have a big up and coming event, Simon, as well. We've got the digital transformation thing with Google and D-Link and other people that are attending. So it's coming up on the 8th of March. So if you want to attend, we've got everything going out. The links are there, and anyone else you might think wants to attend. We've got quite a few people already queuing up to come in, because it's going to be quite a big event. So I hope you enjoyed today as well with this guy. I mean, when I did the demo with him last week, I want to go out there and just shake people and say, I know you think this stuff is just working, and I get it, but when you see this 600, I just couldn't get my head around 600,000 attacks a day, and then they're locking your data, and you can't, that's your data, that's your life's work, and these guys are just, and there's nothing you can do. If you haven't got the backup in place and it's not tested, if you haven't, it's got to be frightening, and people just don't think about it. They always believe it's never going to happen to them. So I thought today was quite important. I really did.
It's important, and as primary schools, well, I think schools generally, but primary schools don't have that internal IT structure, and they're really, really vulnerable, and they also have a lot of teachers that just do what the bloody hell they want and run around and bring devices in schools and all sorts of stuff. So it's really, really tricky.
Well, thank you so much for your time, everyone. I just hope it was enjoyable, and
brilliant, thank you.
I wish you all a good day.
Thanks very much, guys. Thanks.
No worries. Take care, everybody.
Thanks so much.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.